Today, we're going to be using congruent triangles. We will be able to use congruent triangles to prove that corresponding parts are congruent. So think back to what the term corresponding parts mean. They are the angles or sides in the same place in their respective shapes. Because we've seen corresponding angles in figures with parallel lines and transversals, we've also seen corresponding angles and sides in triangles. So, whenever two triangles are stated to be congruent, what conclusion can we make? We know that corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. This is often abbreviated as C, P, C, T, C. So, given these following pairs of triangles, let's state their corresponding parts. So if triangle PQR is congruent to triangle PLM, since the P's came first, we know they're congruent. So angle P is congruent to angle P. Q and L both came second, so they're congruent. R and M came third, so they're congruent. As far as sides go, PQ came first and PL came first, so PQ and PL are congruent. The second two were QR and LM. QR and LM. Which leaves PR and PM to also be congruent. So in our first proof, prove the angle-based theorem, which also means to prove that angle I is congruent to angle K. Given HI is congruent to HK and that HJ bisects IK. So my first statement is HI is congruent to HK and HJ bisects IK, and we know both these things because they were given. We're going to number these because this time we don't have the grid lines to help our proof stay organized. So we're going to number our statements and our reasons so we can see which ones go together more easily. Next, because HJ, let's stop and mark our picture. HI is congruent to HK. Then, because HJ bisects IK, what do we know about IJ and JK? That's right, we know that they are congruent. So we know that IJ is congruent to JK, and we know that because that is the definition of bisect. What else do we know is congruent on this triangle? We know that HJ is congruent to HJ from our reflexive property. Now, do we have enough information on our picture to prove that the triangles are congruent? We do. We know that they must be congruent because if all the sides are congruent, then the triangles are congruent. We know this by side, side, side. So, triangle HJI is congruent to a triangle HJK. Since the triangles are congruent, we know all the parts are congruent. So angle I must be congruent to angle K. They match up in our congruent statement, and we know this because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, also known as CPCT. In our next proof, we want to prove that angle A is congruent to angle D. So let's start with our given information. Angle B is congruent to angle E. FE is congruent to BC, and FE is also parallel to BC. And we know all those things because they were given to us. So we have one side and one angle that we know are congruent. Based on our theorems we can use to prove that they're congruent, We either need to prove another side or another angle congruent. Since FD and AC don't line up perfectly with their endpoints, we can't use the reflexive property this time. So we're going to need to prove that some angles are congruent. Since AC is parallel to FE and they are cut by the transversal here, we know that C has to be congruent to F because they are alternate interior angles. So angle C is congruent to angle F because alternate interior angles are congruent. Now, do we have enough information to prove that the triangles are congruent? We do. We have angle, side, angle. So we know that triangle A, B, C is congruent to triangle D, E, F. Remember to always make sure that the pattern of your letters follows along with the letters that have the same markings. And then finally, since A is first and D is first, we know that angle A is congruent to angle D because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Or you can write CP, C, T, C. And our final proof for today. Given that TM is congruent to MR and JM is perpendicular to TR, prove that JT is congruent to JR. So, start by marking our congruent information. TM is congruent to MR and JM is perpendicular to TR. So let's write down our statements. TM is congruent to MR and JM is perpendicular to TR. And we know this because they were given to us. Next, let's use this perpendicular information to help us out. If these lines or line segments are perpendicular, we know that they make right angles. So we know that angle JMT and angle JMR are right angles. And we know that because that is the definition of perpendicular. Now, once again, we know that these sides are congruent. We know that these angles are congruent because they're both right angles. What else do we know that could help us prove these triangles are congruent? We can use the fact that JM is part of both triangles. So JM is congruent to JM because of the reflexive Therefore, we can prove the triangle is congruent. Triangle JMT is congruent to triangle JMR because of side, angle, side. And since the triangles are congruent, the parts must be congruent. So JT, which was first and last in our congruent statement, is congruent to JR, which were also first and last. And we know this because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, or CPCT. Finally, for our summary, how do these proofs compare to the proofs we've completed the last couple of classes? Fill in your summary, and we'll